favorite maps of Italy. It's actually a map of Jewish Italy, and it's all twisted. It's all wrong. Sorry, Ambassador. It's all wrong because it had to fit in the. This is actually the inside cover of Cecil Roth's History of the Jews of Italy, and I hold on to this. I created this many years ago at the time of Xerox machines. Anybody remembers those times? And so I had to open up the book and put it on the machine, and so it's kind of cut in the middle. It's just wrong. But it's actually not wrong. What the reason I like it is that it gives us an idea of a different kind of Italy. There are many different Italies, and the Jews have helped painting a different map of Italy for a long, long time. Today we are celebrating International Holocaust Memorial Day. This year is also the centennial of the birth of Primo Levi. Primo Levi was one of the authors. Not only he was somebody who really became a literary classic in Italy. People my generations and younger have been learning their Italian literary skills by reading Primo Levi. Forget what he wrote about. But he also really contributed thinking deeply about the heritage of Italian Jews with a very short story. And we'll read just a few excerpts from that just so that we understand how Primo Levi really helped us think about the fact that the Jews of Italy have a long and interesting history, and it's a history that's very much and deeply connected with the history of the Italian peninsula that predates Christianity. And that also, as we will try to explain and show you and sing for you today, it's a history that's full of many different Jewish and other cultures. So this is actually, for me, a prime example of a map of a multicultural history of Italy, of a multicultural Italy that we like to think is an important aspect of Italian culture as a whole. Here is Primo Levi. I like to imagine him in these various through these various photographs. They're all in black and white. As a young writer, he had come back from the concentration camps, and went back to his hometown and back to his apartment. And you see him in the lower picture. That was his desk, but he also told Philip Roth, who was photographed with him at the top center in a beautiful interview that Philip Roth did with him in the 1980s, in the early 80s, that desk in his apartment set where family lore thought he himself, Primo Levi, was born. His mother had given birth to him. So he didn't just go back to his apartment. He really went back to the place of his birth and his town. And I also like to picture him. He was also an artist. He made with wire. He made all kinds of sculptures, and his apartment was completely covered in these sculptures. I visited many times after his death. Unfortunately, I didn't meet him in person, but I met his family and so many of these sculptures. So this is a way for me to share how I see Primo Levi. As I wrote, he was born in Turin in 1919, so 100 years ago, and died in Turin in the same apartment building in 1987. That Primo Levi was the heir to a 2,000 plus year history of the Jews as a global Jewish history that intersects with Italian history as a whole. What I did here with my little orange arrows is I messed up my wrong map of Italy a little bit more and show you here all the directions from which Jews over the centuries arrived to the Italian peninsula. They started arriving over 2,000 years ago, when people were looking at their watch and saying, it's going to be year zero in a few years. And they settled both in Rome and in the southern part of Italy. They followed Hellenistic trade routes, but they arrived directly from Palestine. And they maintained, to this day, an original ritual. Just like the Yemenite Jews did, like the Ashkenazi Jews developed, and the Sephardic Jews and Greek Jews and Provençal Jews did, they developed their own ritual that remains into use in Italian synagogues to this day. Later on, different types of Jewish migration started to reach Italy. So we have north, immigrations from the north. Ashkenazi Jews in the Middle Ages started crossing the Alps for both trade purposes, but also to escape the plague, the Black Death, and persecutions in Germany. They crossed the Alps and settled in northern Italy. And around that time also French Jews, so Western Ashkenazi Jews, there is such a thing. So West Germany and France also settled into Italy. Jews came in from Provence. And then with the expulsion of Jews from Spain, something very interesting started happening in the peninsula. First of all, and this is why the map is kind of gray at the bottom, it's also a historical map, southern Italy was under Spanish rule. So the expulsion of the Jews from Spain involves also the expulsion of the Jews from all of southern Italy. And many of these Jews left the Italian peninsula and moved into the Ottoman Empire, but some of them started moving northbound, which increased the numbers of Jewish communities up north. So the Northwest we're talking about is very much the result of this migration. There are distinguished Italian Jewish families in the north with names like Pugliese or Apulian, who came from the south and settled in the north and maintained the Italian traditions, the ancient Italian traditions, into the 20th and 21st centuries. But these Jews also started arriving from Spain and Portugal, and they were very problematic Jews, especially for the Catholic Church, because many of them had either converted to Christianity or they were suspected to have converted into Christianity. So they carried hybrid identities, and you know, this is a world in the 1500s that didn't really know what to do. Not that today's world does know what to do with hybrid identities, but you can imagine it at that time that posed all kinds of challenges. And this is when both the Republic of Venice and later on the popes came out with brilliant ideas that carries a very haunted legacy. They came up with the idea of ghettos. They started saying, well, we need to control and surveil Jews who are living in our cities, but we also need them. So let's make sure that not only we can control them, but they can also stay. Until then, Jews had to negotiate their what we today would call like their resident cards, or you know, in America, I guess it's still called a green card, even though it's no longer green. In a short story that he published in a beautiful collection called The Periodic Table in 1975, Primo Levi wrote about his own family heritage and tried to come to terms also in a way to explain his own mixed heritage. So his family settled in Piedmont, which for the sake of this program we're referring to as the Italian Northwest, but the region of Piedmont, and which I'm circling up there. And here is a modern geopolitical map of Piedmont. And they started settling there. Well, there's some settlements that date back to Roman times, but really most of the settlements were in the modern era when different Jews from different parts of the world were arriving. So in the region of Piedmont, which is today into modern Italy, a region, there were Jewish settlements, I will show you in a second, in all of these different locations. But who were these Jews? That's part of what we are presenting this evening, and what Primo Levi described in his short story called Argon. You see, I don't like PowerPoints, so I like to. They're too linear for me. In a short, he wrote the periodic table and has a short story named after each element in the periodic table, and he names his ancestry after Argon, and he explains that argon is a part of the noble gases and is called the lazy, and he talks about his own ancestors as the lazy ones, and he explains that they were on, and also that argon is a very, very rare gas. 1% of atmosphere is made of this gas. Is essentially, he's saying, somewhat almost irrelevant, and yet atmosphere would not exist without that. And he explains that his ancestors, and he's actually incredibly wrong, came originally from Spain, went through France, and then settled into the region of Piedmont. It's most likely, from what I understand, that his ancestors were either Italians with southern Italian origins, so came from Palestine, or were French Jews, not Spanish Jews. But what he describes here is a mythology that Italian Jews created from themselves once Italy was unified and they enjoyed civil rights, which happened beginning with 1848. And when Italian Jews had as a history, the history of the ghettos, and it was not a good history to present themselves with, and sort of started having this hypothesis, and by the way, also some German Jews did the same thing around the same time, that they all originated from Spain, from medieval Spain of convivencia, from a time in which Jews and Muslims and Christians were able to live together happily, etc. We know nowadays that it wasn't exactly true, but it was a nice romantic ideal. So he inherits this idea and then complicates things by showing how actually most of the last names of his own family heritage come from French towns in southern France. So they were actually French and Italian Jews. Rejected, not warmly welcome in Turin, they settled in various agricultural towns in southern Piedmont, where they introduced the technology of silk. Even in the most prosperous periods, they were never more than an extremely small minority. Yet, as I will try to explain, this was a very extremely multicultural minority. In all of these towns, some of them very tiny, almost villages, were Jews with their own synagogues who kept ancient traditions and sometimes brought new ones, and who originated from various parts of the world. So in this compressed region and in these very sometimes tiny provincial towns, Jews actually existed in a kind of global way. I like to think of them as sort of marginal cosmopolitans. And we would like to conclude with essentially the same song, but with Jewish theological implications. For the Passover Seder, Que volera che intendera, we hear influences of Spanish into this Judeo-Italian song, Que volera che intendera, who wanted, who understood, what is one. And one is the Lord, two are the tablets of the law, three are the patriarchs, four are the matriarchs, etc., etc. Many of you will know this song. This is our arrangement for it, and our way to conclude this presentation. What? Yeah, I'll just make sure maybe my violin is still tuned. Yeah. Amen.
You can all join in the Amen. volerà, che intenderà, quale cosa la contenderà, quale cosa vuol di due tavole del patto, uno solo è creator, Baruch Baruch Shemo.
Amen. Che volerà, che intenderà, quale cosa la contenterà, quale cosa vuol di tre. Sei sono i nostri padri, Avram, Yitzhak e Yaakov, due tavole del patto, uno solo il creator, Baruch Baruch Shemo. Amen. Che volerà, che intenderà, quale cosa la contenterà, quale cosa vuol di quattro madri di Israele, sarà ricale arache, tre sono i nostri padri Avram, Yitzhak e Yaakov, due tavole del patto, uno solo è creato, Baruch Baruch Shemo. Amen. Che volerà, che intenderà, quale cosa la contenterà, quale cosa vuol di cinque libri della Torah e quattro madri di Israele, sarà ricale arache, tre sono i nostri padri Avram, Yitzhak e Yaakov, due tavole del patto, uno solo è creator, Baruch Baruch Shemo. Amen.
Quattro mani di Israele, sarà ricale arache, tre sono i nostri padri Avram, Yitzhak e Yaakov, due tavole nel patto, uno solo il creator, Baruch Baruch Shemo. Amen.
13. Che volerà, che intenderà, quale cosa la contenterà, quale cosa vuol di tre, degli articoli di fede, 12 tribù di Israele, 11 sono il principale sede, 10 sono i comandamenti, 9 mesi la partoriente, 8 giorni l'Amida, 7 giorni con Shabbat, 6 libri della Mishnah, 5 libri della Torah e 4 madri di Israele, sarà ricale arache, 3 sono i nostri padri Avram, Yitzhak e Yaakov, 2 tavole del patto, uno solo è creator, Baruch Baruch Shemo. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here. Thank you so much for having us here. What a delight. I hope we answered the question that we asked at the beginning. It's a big, varied story, and thank you, Fabrizio Marcelli, for bringing us here to tell you this story. Thanks a lot.